It's 25 years since the launch of Windows 95, but why was it such a big moment in tech?
And what's changed in the Windows world since then?
Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support.
Hi there, welcome to Vertical Hold Behind the Tech News, the weekly podcast where we catch up with Australia's leading technology journalists to go behind the stories and the tech news of the week. I'm Alex Kidman, and I'm joined by Adam Turner, a Melburnian who's strongly considering moving into that phantom 212-story tower that appeared in Microsoft Flight Simulator this week. Adam, how's the virtual move going?
Oh man, I'm sure the views would be amazing and you wouldn't have to worry too much about air traffic these days, but the queue for the lift under social distancing would be a killer, so I think I'm just going to wait until it all blows over. See if I can get one on the cheap.
A sound plan, I think. This week, we're also joined by a man whose editorial resume is damned impressive. Impressive to a level where, if you looked over it, it'd probably find it in leather-bound volumes. You'd be sitting on one of those big armchairs, and I'm certain that some kind of tasteful smoking jacket would be involved. These days, he fills the breakfast host spot on ABC Radio Western Plains. It can only be Nic Healey. Nick, welcome back to the show.
Oh, on radio, they can't see you blush. That was so lovely. Thank you. No, it's great to be back. It's great to chat to you both again.
He's not a real doctor, but he is a real Nick.
There is that. There is that. Now, this week, 25 years ago, if you'd listened to the show, well, you wouldn't have heard anything because podcasts weren't a thing back then, people. What you would have been caught up in was the incredible hype wave that preceded the launch of Windows 95, which came out a quarter century ago this week. Yes, folks, we're all getting older. Adam, apart from us getting older, why was Windows 95 important?
Look, if you dig back through the fossil records, Windows 95 is like the early caveman. It's that missing link between the chimpanzees and what we see roaming around today. For most people at the time, it was their first experience of a GUI, a graphical user interface on the desktop with the windows and a pointer. Of course, you could argue that Microsoft stole those ideas from Apple and GUIs go back to Zero Park, and we saw them on Amiga and other devices, but Microsoft was the one who sort of took it mainstream with Windows 95, and it really changed people's expectations when it came to personal computing. Then under the bonnet, there was a lot going on. It was sort of bridging that gap between DOS and Windows NT code, although DOS still hang around for a while. And the big thing was that Windows 95 was Microsoft's first 32-bit consumer operating system. So that laid the groundwork for a lot that came next. Now, Dr. Nick, you've got a few miles on the clock, like the two of us. What are your memories of Windows 95?
Yeah, it's really funny. I've been trying to think about maybe the first time I encountered a Windows that wasn't 3.11, and I am right now sitting beside a whole bunch of storage containers, and in there, I know I've got some 3.11 discs that I just can't bring myself to throw out. Like I promise you, they are in there.
Vintage.
Along with the 2004 Microsoft Flight Simulator that still has the plastic wrap on it. I know that's in there as well. Just, I can feel it. I kind of came from an Apple environment. That was really interesting. I think that was just high school. High school had an Apple computer lab. So that's what I'd come through. Even for gaming on a computer, it was all done on an Apple IIc, pools of radiance, Curse of the Azure bonds, all that kind of stuff. So when I did see Windows 95, and I don't think it would have been 1995, I'm not going to lie to you, it would have been a year or two later, I don't think I'd encountered anything like it coming from an Apple environment. It was really intriguing to me to see what it could do. And I was surprised, and it's funny to think of it now, I was surprised by how intuitive it felt.
Well, that ease
Compared
of use,
to DOS.
Everything's easier than DOS. But that ease of use, that consumer friendliness was, I think, such a huge part of why Windows 95 was important because, well, Apple had its market and Apple had all sorts of problems with the 90s, and we could do a complete separate podcast on that and probably get Apple's lawyers involved because they don't like that kind of thing. But up until that point, you had DOS and you had Windows 3.11, so you could do, or Windows 3 and 2 and so on before it, but you could do that graphical user environment, but there was a ton of configuration. It was all really kind of kludgy, and basically of interest to tech types like, well, the three of us largely. 95, I think, brought it into that consumer space. Adam, rather famously, Microsoft paid the Rolling Stones something like $12 million to hype Windows 95 by licensing Start Me Up as their ad song.
Oh my God, I'd forgotten.
Now, Adam, you're a big Stones fan, far bigger than I am. Is there a better Stones song that they should have paid for?
I think retrospectively, I can't get no satisfaction would have been like in closer alignment with the Windows user experience. But at the time, this was huge. At the time, this was like, this was rock and roll. This was massive. And people queued up, at midnight launches and all that kind of stuff. It's hard to believe now that anyone would get excited about a version of Windows, but it really was that big.
But that's really essential. We often associate that consumer fandom, that consumer experience. We think of Apple these days.
Yeah.
You think of the midnight queues. That was there. And in many ways, Microsoft was very prescient about what they wanted to do with this, who they wanted to market it to. Sure, it was for the nerds like you and I, but it was also for the people who just thought it was about time to get a computer at home. And it was a way of saying, this is relatable. It was really interesting to see. It was a cleverness that they would quickly lose and not regain for a long time.
Yeah, because when we talk about personal computer, really most of what you'd seen before that from Microsoft was more personal, aimed at the business user. There were consumer computers, but really it was business first, consumer second. As I said before, this was an effort to sort of marry those two worlds a little bit and bring some of that business performance and business features into the consumer world and sort of make personal computing more of a thing that you'd want to do at home that was on equal par. And it was the beginning of that sort of shift where we have the situation today where most people, their computer is better at home than it is at work. But there was a time when it was the other way around. 20 years ago, the computer you had at home was nowhere near as good as the computer you had at work. This was probably the beginning of that shift where computers at home actually started to step up.
Yeah, well, if we're going to talk about Microsoft having a moment of cool, I think we need to talk about the other big marketing push that they had, which was the world's first cyber sitcom. I don't know if either of you gentlemen have seen it. It's a promotional and training video featuring Jennifer Aniston and Matthew Perry. And if there's a more 90s couple than that, I don't know what it is.
Beavis and Butthead.
It's amazing. I took one for the Vertical Hold team and I watched this whole thing before we recorded this show. And it's the most awkward, unfunny, and yet so 90s thing possible. There's an
You mean
entire
apart
joke
from Steve
section.
Ballmer himself?
Much more so. There's an entire section where Jennifer Aniston simply can't say the word floppy because that's apparently the height of 90s comedy. But I watched it and I was struck by the fact that actually I get this, even though it's incredibly painful in hindsight. And we might see if we can embed the YouTube version of it on the Vertical Hold webpage for people to watch. But even though I was appalled by it, I could see how it would sell it to the everyday consumer because that's what Microsoft grabbed with Windows 95.
They did, and it was a really important turning point for personal computing. Adam, you had it before. They went from thinking of the idea of a computer as something you just might have in the home to thinking of a computer as something you had to have in the home. And that's really interesting. That is a fundamental shift in thinking. We don't get where we are now, 25 years later, without that shift.
Well, there's one other thing, though, that Windows 95 didn't have that later turned out to be terribly, terribly important. And I'm going to give the two of you a little clue. Now, we can't afford, on the Vertical Hold budget, to license Start Me Up, sadly. Mick Jagger wants a little bit too much. But I can bring back this classic tune if the quarter-century-old technology wants to work for me.
Oh, no. Oh, make it go away. Make it go away. 20 minutes to download one song. Make it go away.
All I can think of is Marge Simpson. The computer's making funny noises.
But the internet, I mean, having a browser presence, really, because that's what we tend to think of as the internet. Windows 95 had WinSock. Remember WinSock?
Yeah,
Painfully, yes.
yes.
But Microsoft still missed the
why would
boat.
you do this to us?
Yes. Thought we were friends, man. But Microsoft really did miss the boat on the broader, like the World Wide Web. Some of that was in there, but they then had the opportunity to go further. And Bill Gates has sort of said that was one place where they dropped the ball. But yeah, it was, especially if you wanted to do more than just get on bulletin boards, it was sort of that next level of technology that made it easier to do things and connect.
It's really interesting to go back and remember the way it was for a long time with the internet, because you had the computer that you accessed the internet on, and getting there was a procession. We're so entrenched in just having that access now that you forget that the internet was something you went out of your way to explore. It's why we still say, surfing the internet, because if you had to go through the dial up, if you had to power on the computer, if you had to do bits and pieces, make it worth your while. And it's, I remember, and we're going back 2000, we're going back only 5 years after this. We had groups like NEC and the famous at the time internet enabled microwave, and people were up in arms. What rubbish is this? Why? And the point was, no one wanted to build an internet-enabled microwave in the year 2000. What they wanted to do was divorce the idea of the internet from the computer. They wanted to show that it was device agnostic. And, oh my God, 20 years later, here we are.
Well, 20 years later, Amazon makes a microwave with not only the internet, but Alexa on board.
Yes, exactly.
But probably wasn't until
come back, everything's forgiven.
Probably wasn't until we got decent smartphones that we actually got that bit where, to the point where we're kind of immersed in the internet now. As you say, it's all around us. You don't have to go out of your way to find it. It's just there at your fingertips when you need it.
And that's really important too. I laughed the other day. I had some guests around, and they were like, "We can't get on your Wi-Fi," and I'm like, "What?" Because it was device saturated, and I'm like, "What the hell have I got on the Wi-Fi? This is that and that, and
That.
all light bulbs and this and here we go. All right, yeah."
Windows 95 also, though, brought with it a whole bunch of technical aspects which seem very obvious, seem very everyday now, aside from the internet, which were really big at the time. I mean, things like file names which could be longer than 8 characters, which sounds so dumb now. But was it? I mean, it was an absolute revelation at the time that you didn't have to have an 8.3 file name.
And things like multitasking and the start button and the taskbar and things that we sort of look back now and think they're a bit cliche, but this stuff was a big deal and it changed the way people use their computers. And you needed longer file names because you were doing more with your computer. You were doing more things at once and it was actually becoming more useful. This was the beginning of your computer being more than you just turned it on to do one thing and then turned it off again. Like you perhaps turned it on to play games with an earlier machine, and then you turn it off again, or you turn it on to do one thing. This was, your computer's becoming that gateway to all the different things you'd want to do.
Yeah, well, the gaming thing's interesting. Nick, I'm guessing if you were an Apple user at the time, you never really had to do the whole config sys and auto exec battle that DOS involved, did you?
I never did, and when I came to PC much later, all of that stuff was thankfully behind me. But I certainly had friends who did, and of course, they were. Many of the people I knew who'd got into Windows were coming from Commodores or Amigas and things like that. So I feel like, there was maybe for them a natural progression. But if you were trying to do that just straight off the bat, woof. And also, no pun intended, with straight off the bat. Sorry.
It was great. That was a great pun. But look, the whole idea, the whole idea of plug and play, and it pretty quickly got corrupted into plug and pray because it wasn't as rock solid as Microsoft said it was. Certainly not for Windows 95.
Say it's not true.
The whole idea that you could have a 32-bit driver that was recognized for a thing, you didn't have to go in and assign an I/O port or flick a bridging switch on an ISA card or stuff like that, was actually revolutionary. It actually was that modular computing that, again, these days we absolutely take for granted. You've got something with a USB plug on the end, you plug it in, and look, 99% of the time, it literally does just work.
And you tell kids that today and they don't believe you.
We are
They
getting a
don't
bit
believe
more
you, though.
Yorkshireman here. Yes.
But it is true. There's so much that we take for granted in terms of I can just go down to the shops, buy a mouse, buy a keyboard, buy a camera, buy a charger, buy whatever it is, and I know that it's going to work. There's that universal access there. And this was the beginning of that. It was still painful, but it was a step in the right direction.
It's funny you mentioned USB, and I am jumping ahead a little bit. I remember working for Internet AU, one of the magazines I did work for, and I remember the first time we got a USB webcam sent in. And I'm not going to lie, it blew my mind. One plug, it was providing power and all the data, and it just worked. I'd never encountered anything like it.
Well, going back into my own history, the first USB thing I ever came across, I was working for the not terribly lamented Gateway Computers, the people, in fact, who picked up Osborne when they crashed and burned in the Australian context, and we really are going back a ways. But they were heavy competitors to Dell at the time, and they both worked off this kind of build-to-order model, which meant they had fairly cutting-edge stuff. They were shipping motherboards with USB on them before there were USB devices, and we used to get all these calls. What's this port for? What does it do? Oh, it's the USB port. So what does it do? Well, you plug things into it. What things? Well, nothing yet. Because there were no devices. You're right. I can recall writing pieces at APC, probably same time you were writing for Internet AU, of, right, here are the first range of USB devices. Isn't this amazing that you can plug something in and it largely finds it and works? Again, plug and pray was still a thing into the early 2000s. The other big thing for Windows 95, not that it was new, but it definitely made some big changes, was gaming and the way that PC gaming works. And that whole plug and play thing actually plays into that because sound cards and graphics cards actually started working without requiring a serious knowledge of programming just to install them.
A lot of the early games you would have been playing on Windows 95 were still really games that were just running on DOS under the bonnet, things like Quake and stuff like that. But you also started to see games that were being ported to actually run on Windows 95 itself. Like Doom 95 was a big deal, and Windows went out of the way to make sure that Doom ran on Windows 95 rather than just running on DOS. And it was kind of the beginning of that idea of, up until that point, most of what you played on a computer, on a personal computer, was often just a port from somewhere else. And a computer was just like a second-rate way of playing a game that you could play somewhere else. But this was the beginning of the rise of, well, at least a milestone in the rise of PC gaming becoming a thing in itself. And you can see that, the ancestors, you look back at your Command and Conquers and your StarCrafts and your Quakes and your Diablos, and you can see, like, again, the caveman ancestors of the cutting-edge PC gaming today.
It's really interesting. I was pretty spoiled for gaming because before going to Internet AU, I was deputy editor on PlayStation Magazine. So I was a bit of a console
you did get around, didn't you?
I really, really did. I was a bit of a console
Those leather-bound volumes I was talking about in the intro, they are numerous.
But I had a mate called Roger, and Roger had actually previously worked as tech support at Next Media, the publisher of both those magazines. But Roger had gone on and actually taught himself how to do special effects. So Roger now has quite an IMDb listing, but on weekends, rather than play any of this sort of stuff on a Windows computer, he'd drag home a Silicon graphics machine from his workplace.
The good stuff.
And we'd play Quake on a Silicon graphics using a projector to put it up against a wall and get very drunk and enjoy the hell out of ourselves. So I was way spoiled. What's PC gaming? Never heard of it. On your bikes, kids. Come on.
Yeah, well, honestly, though, at the time, Apple gaming was, not so much a thing. So there was that problem as well.
But this was also the point where LAN gaming became big, and like people would stay at the office after work or at lunchtime. You'd be playing Doom. You'd be doing things on the office network that was still a hassle to do at home. Like Nick was saying, that the tech you had at work was better than the tech you had at home.
Oof. Amazing. Yeah. Quake Arena. Hello. Never try playing that at home. Play it at work.
Yeah. Well, and before that, Doom itself. Doom was absolutely the killer app of its time. Probably sold more than Windows did at the time. It was absolutely immense. And yes, getting that onto Windows 95 and moving that forward was a huge thing. It's kind of funny, though, in retrospect, because I think Windows 95 makes that point where you start to get much better graphics capabilities and that PC console gaming divide happens. And even Microsoft gets into that because the early Xbox, whilst it was PC parts, it was a very console first kind of approach. We're only now getting that convergence again, in fact, basically down to Microsoft, where it says, something like Flight Simulator, for example, which we're mentioning in the intro, is an Xbox and a PC title because they're pushing this singular vision again.
Yeah, and I think that's actually really essential. Microsoft, if you go back over their history, there's often a series of ball drops. But when they notice their fumble, when they pick up, they actually can make some genuine change. And what they are doing with games that will run across Windows and across Xbox, how they're making that work, even the Xbox platform in general, which, do not forget, was absolutely derided when we heard Microsoft was going to do a console. The contempt was enormous. It's been great. And, again, as an ex-editor of official Xbox magazine, I was always really impressed with what they'd done with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, Windows 95 actually comes into that whole Microsoft hardware story because they're also responsible, of course, for the first wide-scale optical mice, that original IntelliMouse, which they did a kind of classic version of a couple of years ago.
Oh, yeah,
and
yeah.
Actually, their gaming hardware. I mean, the remember the Sidewinder force feedback joystick?
Yes, I do. They were great. I'm not meaning it to sound like that. I'm just like, oh my God, that was a long time ago.
Right now he's rummaging
They
through
were
that box next to
fantastic.
him because he knows there's one in there somewhere. Got one here somewhere.
I'm not going to lie to you. There is a Logitech Cyberman in there somewhere. If anyone remembers what they looked like, they were not good. They were not good. But it was just so weird. I had to keep it. But no, this was the funny thing is quite often when we were hearing the rumblings about Microsoft coming out with Xbox, people were like, Microsoft doesn't do hardware. And Microsoft were like, I'm sorry, we don't do hardware? What?
And of course, the other side of all of this is 25 years ago, Windows 95 was a brand new thing. Now, of course, it's an incredibly deprecated thing, but a lot has changed in that time. I mean, Microsoft went from 95 to 98 to 98 SE. I don't even want to invoke the dark gods and mention Windows ME because I still have terrible flashbacks.
And Puck will make amends.
Exactly. Before really starting to merge in those code bases of MT and 95 through XP and Windows
2000.
7 and 8 and 10 and Windows 2000, yes, of course. Yeah. Can't forget that. Oh, Microsoft Bob, I suppose. No, wait, no, I don't want to mention that one either. But kind of where we've come, I think, still is very informed by what Windows 95 did. The example that really pops to mind is, I think it was Windows 8 that did the whole Metro tablet-style interface, and people hated it because they were screaming at that time to get the start menu back.
Oh, the start menu was a huge deal. That was so important. You don't get to craft a way people interact with your operating system and then remove the one thing that people are going to be looking for without it having a bloody uproar.
And they backed down on that one too. At the time they're like, oh no, it's the way to go. But with Windows 10, they backed down and said, oh yeah, maybe you can turn that crap off if you don't want it and go back to the way it used to be. Because as you say, they'd spent decades teaching people this is how you use a computer. If you knew one thing about how to use a computer, you knew where the start menu was. To take that away was just insanity.
Yeah, wild insanity. And look, Windows has, how do I put this delicately, had its problems over the years.
We don't worry about delicately. Just tell us it is, man. Lay it down.
It has had some bloody missteps. And as a former editor of Windows XP magazine and the launch editor of Windows Vista magazine in Australia, there's been some missteps.
This whole episode is just going in your LinkedIn profile, isn't it?
Oh, God. This is actually giving me flashbacks. This is horrendous. I love it.
See, I'm just pondering the existence of Windows Vista magazine as a thing at all, but But look, you're not wrong. And in that time as well, I guess one of the big changes as well is at the time Windows 95 came out, Microsoft celebrated because they sold however many millions of copies it was almost instantly. Midnight launches
Mm.
were absolutely a thing. These days, Microsoft doesn't actually sell much of anything at all. They're not actually a software selling company, they're largely a services company.
But how relieving has that been? How relieving has it been to not be stuck in that box mentality of having to go to a shop and buy a copy of the actual operating system you need to do anything on your computer? That shift has been remarkable. It's been wonderful.
Are you suggesting that the 13 floppies that Windows 95 came on were something of a burden?
I'm suggesting that before we got to software as a service, we had a very narrow mentality of what people were doing with computers, even when we thought we didn't. And the shift has been incredible. Again, and obviously, I know this is one of those statements that, is implied by itself, but we don't get to where we are now in technology without those changes in thinking.
Also, one of the problems with the way it used to be of you get a new version of Windows every couple of years is every second
Ugh.
one was a dud. And the reason why it was a dud is actually because every second one was the one where they'd introduce all these new technologies and break everything. And then in the one after that, they'd bed it down. And if you look back, everybody loved Windows XP. Everybody hated Vista because it changed all this stuff. Everybody loved Windows 7 because it bedded down all the changes in Vista and they became consistent and universal and everything just worked. And everybody hated Windows 8. Now people seem to be reasonably happy with Windows 10. Hopefully we can stop playing that game now of break it with one thing and then fix it with the next and have a bit more of a consistent user experience across, the years.
Alex, just remind me, you were on the same boat as me in 2001 that took us out to Parramatta or something like that to see Rove McManus launch Windows XP.
I was indeed. I mean, that led to my favourite bit of a vendor tap that I've ever got. Certainly the least appropriate bit of vendor merch that I've ever received. I think Nick knows where I'm going with this one. So to give the broader audience a bit of perspective on this, as tech journalists, you get given like hats and caps with vendor logos on, and the vast majority of them you never want to wear anywhere except maybe when you're painting a bathroom. Sorry to all the PR people listening out there, but
that's funny because I have Microsoft T-shirts with paint on them for that very reason.
But the Windows XP tech reviewer bag had a copy of the software in there, which was great, although a bit scary because one of the perils of working on a tech mag when a new version of Windows came out was you had to install it because you had to know about it, you had to write about it. But typically you had one computer. You had the computer you worked on. So you had to put it into your live environment. It was a scary time. But even scarier than that were the Microsoft Windows XP boxer shorts.
Oh, I knew you were going there.
I'm sure Rove's got that on his LinkedIn profile. I'm sure that's a highlight of his career.
Yeah, he's probably still got a pair. Just they would have paid him in nothing but Windows XP boxer shorts.
Are you suggesting Rove wouldn't have worn his Windows XP boxer shorts? They'd be worn out by now, surely.
He'd have an everyday pair and like a formal pair.
Oh, the gold-plated pair, yes, that's true.
I also feel really bad because I think 19 years ago, that was the first time I'd ever heard of Rove McManus. I had no idea what he was doing on stage, trying to shill Windows XP. I was absolutely mystified.
Microsoft, part of the thing with, and you were getting at this before, Adam, part of the thing with Windows 10, though, is that it's constantly iterating. They've basically said, we're not releasing Windows again, which has this interesting effect, though, because for the vast majority of people, you don't buy Windows, you just buy a computer.
Yeah.
You don't really think about it that way, although, of course, you then don't have that level of ownership, and obviously people who do more techie, often gamers, for example, who do more DIY build-it-yourself options will then go chasing down the kind of cheapest OEM copy route.
Buy a mouse and get a copy of Windows.
Yeah, because clearly the mouse cannot run without Windows 10 in place.
Can we talk Windows on mobile for a second, though? Because there's been so many go. Yeah, I think we do. Because, let's talk about Windows CE, which was nicknamed Wince for an incredibly good reason.
So I'm gonna say something quite shocking here. I actually liked Windows CE for what it was at the time. Apple gets so much credit for saying, here's the iPhone, here's apps on a phone. Isn't this amazing? Well, sorry, Microsoft, to their credit, maybe not well, but they were doing it years before that.
Yeah, look, I've got an HP Palm Top somewhere that ran Wince, and there was a lot of promise to it, but very little delivery, and I think that was always
true. It wasn't flawless by a long shot. But Nick, we kind of moved on in Windows on a mobile from there, didn't we?
We did, to things I know I should remember because I've used them, but barely can, if I'm going to be honest with you. I think I remember having a Nokia that was still running Windows, and it was actually the sole bit of technology I had to try and run a magazine when I started with a new company that had not maybe timed its hardware acquisition with its staffing acquisition as well as it could have.
Oh dear.
And then we
That
had
was when
Windows
I was editor of T3
Mobile.
magazine.
Actually, now we were working together. I knew you when you're an editor of T3.
Yes.
It was Windows Mobile, because Windows Mobile changed names like 4 times as it tried to reinvent itself. But it was Windows Mobile, and then it was Windows Phone, and then it was Windows Mobile again. But probably before the iPhone came along, the best phone was the things like the HTC Jazz Jam. And they were running Windows Mobile, and they had proper QWERTY keyboards on them, and they were probably the equivalent of the BlackBerry. They were the best thing going. They were clunky as, but they showed a lot of promise. You could actually get things done. A lot of journalists own these because they were one of the first 4G phones in Australia. And it wasn't until the iPhone came along and showed you, it doesn't have to run like a dog and
You're
be a clunky experience.
Yeah, I was going to say 4G or 3G? 3G,
yeah, actually 3G. Yeah, sorry, 3G. I forgot how old I was.
Yeah. It was the one that came with coronavirus 1.1.
Yes.
Oh dear.
Yes, the Jazz Jam was the first 3G, one of the first 3G phones, and a lot of journalists owned them because it was actually becoming feasible, if somewhat painful, to work on one of these things.
There were a lot of really good attempts at making the mobile device a work device before we just kind of took it on board. I actually remember, Alex, your brother, using a fold-up keyboard and a Palm Pilot to write whole articles, and I was in shock. We were on a plane, we were flying to Melbourne for something, and he knocked out 2 articles while I was still flicking through Qantas magazine. So, these were, the technology was there. The issue was you had to bevel off those pain points yourself, and that's what kicked people away.
And I think even when they actually shifted into what was Windows Phone, they kept too many of the pain points. I mean, the big specific obvious pain point that I think Windows Phone had from day one that it never really shook off one way or the other was app availability. I remember going to the launch of that. They did pre-briefings. Nick, I cannot remember if you were there or not, but I remember sitting with another regular on Vertical Hold, Jennifer Dudley-Nicholson from News, and they were going through the apps and what would be available for Windows Phone. And she stuck her hand up and said, "Is there a Twitter app?" And they went, "Oh, no." And her jaw just dropped. And I think everyone in the room went, "Wait, what?" And this is post-iPhone, but this is post their first iPhone coming to Australia. So it was just like, why are you not? Why is that not a thing? Because it was, incredibly important in a social media sense
Twitter?
at the time. And they just kind of continued on that. Not quite enough apps. The UI was interesting, that whole tile thing, and I know there are people out there who are incredibly passionate about it, but it never quite got there.
No, and this is the problem, is that they had a device that could work really well if it had what people needed to do. And, I used to write articles about this. I'm like, I would shift over to a BlackBerry or something like that, away from Android every time they've tried to reinvent themselves, if it was a seamless experience, if I wasn't giving away the apps I had become used to using. Same with Windows. That was a beautiful looking interface for a long time there, Windows Phone. Probably better than anything that's around now, honestly. I love that style of it. But there was nothing on it. I just I'm remembering using one of the old school Blackberries and using the Twitter app for the first time. And it was beautiful with that keyboard, with the way it worked. It was a bit of you'd buy a Blackberry just to use Twitter on it. Like it was so perfectly done. Microsoft never had that. Oh, you'd buy it just for this app. And it's a shame because it was a beautiful, beautiful OS.
And the hardware was decent too. I mean, I think it was the Nokia 1080, that big yellow phone, which had an amazing camera for its time, it was way ahead of anything else you could get. But yeah, the rest of the experience was just not there. Well, that just about wraps up another episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Nic for joining us for this week's show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, the good folks of Dubbo and surrounding regions get to hear you every weekday morning, but you're also podcasting with another regular Vertical Hold guest, Seamus Byrne. Tell us about that.
I am. Seamus and I get together for the Bite Side podcast once a week. You can usually find it on a Wednesday, depending on when our schedules combine. We just talk about pretty much anything that's caught our attention. Could be gaming, could be tech culture, could be tech. We just don't mind. We're just having a crack at it.
Could be what you ordered on Wish and didn't indeed get.
It could be a lot of that.
And if folks want to find you on social media, where do they do that?
Oh, look, the best place to do it is Twitter. It is Dr. Nic, but that is a DR, an underscore, because they were cool once, and then just NIC.
And of course, you can catch up with us on Twitter at VerticalHoldAU, online at verticalhold.com.au, or via the Vertical Hold Facebook page.
And as always, thanks everyone for listening and sitting through us reminiscing for days gone past. We were wearing an onion on our belt, as was the style at the time. Please, tell your friends about us. Leave us a review on your podcasting platform of choice and help us spread the good word. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support. And the whole time I thought I was in charge and he's just been pulling the strings. I've been the puppet.
Damn it, he knows too much. Then again, he's not the first Adam.
True.